There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Freddy Reads, and I am stimulated to the max because just about an hour or so ago I had what I pretentiously refer to as a literary salon at my house. It was a late afternoon tea party for three Canadian novelists who happened to live in Saskatoon, who some of them didn't know each other at all, and that was so fun to organize. So the guest list was Sharon Patala, of course, and Karen Melberg-Schreer, whose debut novel, Small Reckonings, is in strong contention for my novel of the year. It's certainly going to be in my top 2 or 3 reads. Oh my god, what a powerful novel. And Meredith Hambrock, who I have interviewed. All of these wonderful writers I have interviewed on my channel, but Meredith Hambrock as well for her 2 novels. And oh my goodness, we had such a good time. So here's a couple pictures. The picture of the whole group of us. We were standing in front of lamps, so the lighting is not that great, but there's a good one of Meredith and Karen and I in the basement of my library. And just they were talking about writing and writing prizes and this and that, and it was just exactly what I was hoping it would be, and hope it becomes a regular thing. Wouldn't that be lovely? But they're all lovely people. Sharon and I are good friends. I feel very friendly towards the other two and hope that we might, over the course of time, become so as well. I just loved it. Oh my god. Do I have any other personal news? No calamities to report, nothing else. Kenji's good, I'm good, and that's enough of that. So, without further ado, another amazing mystery guest. Let's go meet this person. And this week's mystery guest is the Canadian writer Jack Wang, now based out of Ithaca, New York, where he is joining us, but previously from Vancouver. Jack, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's so great to meet you. Your debut novel, The Riveter, came out in February, and it sounds amazing. You also had a short story collection come out a few years before that, which was called We Two Alone. I'd like to hear a bit about that as well, but let's get started with The Riveter. Tell us about it.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. It's great to be here. The Riveter is my debut novel, and it's set during the Second World War. And it's set in actually a number of places: Vancouver, ventures overseas, it ventures to the American South. And it's about a Chinese Canadian who serves in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. I would just have to remember that at the time, Chinese Canadians didn't have citizenship in the franchise. And a lot of Chinese Canadians saw it as an opportunity to earn citizenship in the franchise by serving, by proving their loyalty, their love of country. And my character, Josiah Chang, eventually finds his way into the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion and in various European theaters of the war.
And I believe that that was a long process and almost methodical or strategic series of steps that he took before he was able to actually get into the force. Wasn't he involved in, what was it, building military something or other?
Yeah, building ships, hence the title, The Riveter. So Josiah Chang ventures from the Caribou to what he thinks of as the great metropolis, Vancouver. And tragedy has led him to leave his home and to find new work. And he finds it in a wartime shipyard. Of course, Canada contributed a lot of cargo ships or victory ships to the Allied cause, transporting goods and material to England. And so he works in a shipyard in Vancouver, and there he meets a woman named Poppy Miller. And this is an important element of the novel, which is both a war story and a love story. And he meets Poppy Miller, and it is an interracial relationship. They're instantly attracted to each other, but as you can imagine at the time, the relationship was fraught in many ways. And without giving away too much, it ultimately is what compels him to want to serve for the love of this woman.
Tell us a bit more about Poppy.
Yeah, Poppy is a woman who is of English Canadian background. And the perhaps first spark of inspiration for this character came from doing research on wartime shipyards. And at the time, there was a lot of segregation in wartime shipyards between men and women. There were a lot of rules about modesty, like women having to cover their hair, eating in separate lunchrooms, and so on and so forth, trying to keep men and women apart in the shipyard. But despite this, I read about a woman who emerged from a closed door, followed shortly by man in the shipyard. And it was clear that they had just done something untoward, something indiscreet in the shipyard behind closed doors. And that might have been the first germ of the character, the idea that despite all these edicts and strictures, here was a woman who was sexually open, sexually free, daring and adventurous. And that gives you a sense of who Poppy is. And Josiah first spies her in the shipyard driving a jitney, which is like a short flatbed truck built on a Jeep chassis. Basically, she's a driver in the yard. And of course, women entered the workforce, occupied traditionally masculine roles. And Josiah's just struck by her and how different she seems. And that's how their relationship begins.
And Josiah gets this job as a riveter, fastening together the ribs and steel plates of victory ships.
Right.
I was vaguely aware of what a riveter was, and I maybe should promise at this point in the interview that I'm not going to make a terrible pun about how riveting the novel is, although I guess I just did. But
Right.
how much do we see him at work? And
Yeah, we
it's
do in the early part of the novel see a lot of him in the shipyard. And in order to fasten these steel ships together, these 10,000-ton cargo ships, took about 3 million rivets. And the rivets were put in by rivet gangs, and someone had to heat up the rivet in coke until it was molten and soft, and they had to throw it to a catcher, and then a holder had to hold the rivet in place, and then the strongest person on the crew, who was a riveter, then had to hammer in a second head on the other side with a rivet gun. And so Josiah Chang, he's a big, strong, able guy. He used to be a faller or a lumberjack. And so he's a very able guy, and he gets the coveted job, the best paying job of riveter. And that's actually how Poppy first spies him in the yard, seeing him up on the scaffold, wielding his rivet gun, his muscles rippling in the heat. And so the reader does get quite a glimpse of the wartime shipyard, and it's based on Burrard Dry Dock. And in fact, it's a fictionalized version of Burrard Dry Dock, which was a real shipyard in Vancouver. They built a second yard during the war to handle all the demand on the south shore of Falls Creek. And that's where this love story begins.
And so eventually Josiah is able to be enlisted and goes to fight. So
Mhm.
your choice of the title, the riveter rather than the soldier,
Yeah, right.
suggests that there's something pretty central about that part of the story or about that job. Is that a fair statement for me to make?
Yeah, yeah. On the one hand, as a riveter, he's wielding a rivet gun. And during the war, a lot of Chinese Canadians couldn't serve in the armed forces or in the military. They wanted to serve nonetheless, so they served in wartime industries. But that rivet gun is also an analog for the Bren gun or the machine gun that Josiah later carries. So at one point, he thinks about the fact that he's wielding all these kinds of guns in service of his country. And of course, the riveter is also just someone who rivets in the broadest sense. And he is a riveting guy. Not to turn to that pun again, but he is a riveting guy. And so he is strong, again, as I say, able, and he rivets Poppy's attention.
I'm always curious when I interview writers about the germ of the story. How did this all start for you as a writer, this story, this novel?
Yeah, I think this story came to me when I first learned about the exploits of Chinese Canadians during the Second World War. Something I hadn't learned about as a kid growing up and didn't learn about in high school. I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. I'm not too sure I learned about it in university either, but I came across videos and books that documented the service of Chinese Canadians, and I was just fascinated by these exploits. And I felt like the story of Chinese Canadians and their service should be more widely told. This year, we're celebrating the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day or VE Day or the end of the war. And I don't think in that time and mind you, there's been reference books and documentary films and so on and so forth. I don't think in that time there's been a narrative, a story in the form of fiction or memoir about any Chinese Canadian who served. 20,000 Chinese Americans served in the American armed forces, and I don't off the top of my head recall narratives coming from Chinese American writers either. I think partly it's because that was a very self-effacing generation in general, but I also think Chinese Canadians in particular were rather self-effacing and not ones to talk about their exploits. And in some cases, they actually worked in special operations, and so really couldn't talk about some of the things they had done.
Sounds just fascinating. Tell me a bit about your short story collection.
Yeah, yeah. We Two Alone came out in 2020, and unfortunately, we all know what happened in 2020. It was supposed to be published in June. The publication date got pushed back to September. A lot of people at the time were optimistic that a few months delay would circumvent major issues, but of course, we know what happened. And it was an interesting time to debut, but it's a collection about the Chinese diaspora over the past 100 years and set on 5 different continents. Like The Riveter, the first story takes place in Vancouver. It's actually set a couple of decades earlier in the 1920s. And then it traverses different times and places. The first story is about a Chinese Canadian laundry boy who yearns to play organized hockey, but because of ostracism, he actually pretends to be a girl and joins a women's team. And there was, in fact, burgeoning women's hockey leagues and so on in Western Canada at that time. And then the collection just ventures quite far afield. It goes to Shanghai, and then it goes to Vienna and talks about the Consul General of China in Austria, annexed at the time by Nazi Germany, and his efforts to write exit visas to help Jewish Austrians escape. It ventures to South Africa in the era of apartheid, eventually moves to England and then the United States. So it's a wide-ranging portrait of the Chinese diaspora over the past 100 years.
So it sounds like, at least so far, your imagination is very much rooted in historical narratives. Do you think that, well, I'm about to ask you what you're working on now, but is that kind of where you see yourself continuing to locate or create your stories?
In the short story collection, it moves, the stories kind of move in chronological order and they move across the century until we wind up actually in the 21st century in New York City. So there are contemporary stories or more contemporary stories, and I enjoy historical fiction. Every story you commit to has an opportunity cost. And sometimes when you're writing historical fiction, as fascinating as it can be, you also want to write about a contemporary moment, or sometimes you wish you could write about things about which you don't have to do quite so much research and just writing things that you might just know more intimately from firsthand experience. And while I'm not actively working on the next project now, I am thinking about a novel that will be more contemporary so that, as a writer, I can show my range, as it were, and to write both historical and contemporary kinds of fiction.
What brought you to Ithaca, New York from Vancouver?
Yeah, so actually, my path from Vancouver to Ithaca is quite circuitous. So I did grow up in Vancouver, went to high school in Vancouver. As I mentioned, I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. I actually studied biology and anthropology, but that's where I took my first creative writing class and minored in English. And from there, that was a springboard to doing a Master's of Fine Arts in creative writing. But I went to Tucson, Arizona to do it at the University of Arizona. After which I had taught as a TA and I really enjoyed the profession of teaching. So after my MFA, I taught for a few years in Minnesota. And at that point, I felt like I wanted to, if I was going to profess for the rest of my life, that I wanted to arm myself with a little bit more knowledge. So I went to get my PhD in English at Florida State University. It was an emphasis in creative writing. And it was from there that I got a tenure track job at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York, and that was 20 years ago. This is actually the beginning of my 20th year at Ithaca College. I'm now a full professor and a longtime resident now of Ithaca. So that's the circuitous route by which I got from Vancouver to Ithaca, New York.
Very interesting. And so you consider yourself to be a Canadian writer.
Right.
What's
Yeah.
it like being a Canadian writer in America at this moment? I'm
Yeah.
nervous to even
Yeah.
ask, but
I got naturalized during the first Trump administration shortly after he was elected. And for a long time, it seemed, especially since I lived in New York, that maybe voting wasn't that significant because it's already a very blue state, or which is to say, a very left-leaning state. But after the first Trump election, I decided it was time to get naturalized. And at the time, I did a social media post where I said that I was an American at the ballot box, but Canadian in my soul. And that's still how I feel. I feel like a Canadian. I always identify as a Canadian. But of course, I felt like I had to fight the good fight as an American in the ballot box. And of course, this is a very distressing time to be living in the United States. And I'm actually going to be part of a panel at the Vancouver Writers Festival called About Canada that's going to be talking about Canadian identity at this very fraught moment. And all I can say is that we're living through authoritarianism. Let's not make any bones about it. And I hew to my Canadian identity and the values it represents, especially in this moment. But also, as an American, it's important to speak up and to resist, and I'm trying to do all those things.
Good luck.
Thanks.
What books do you have to recommend?
Yeah, I have a few books that I wanted to mention. One book that I read recently that I enjoyed is called Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin. She is a Vietnamese French writer, and this is a novel about a family that tries to leave Vietnam after the Vietnam War. And three siblings are sent ahead of the rest of the family. And unfortunately, the rest of the family doesn't make it. That's the premise of the story. And so these three siblings, an older sister who's guardian to her two younger brothers, find their way to a refugee camp, and after various trials and tribulations, wind up, and various mistakes too, wind up in the UK. And it's about how these siblings try to make a life as refugees, as wandering souls, if you will, in the UK. I thought it was a beautiful novel. Beautifully done, some formally interesting things, some blending of fiction and nonfiction. So that's one title. A couple of other titles I wanted to mention are books that I've blurbed recently. So I'd like to support some up-and-coming writers, or at least up-and-coming books, as it were. One is Oxford Soju Club by Jinwoo Park.
Yeah, just very hot off the press, I believe.
Yeah, very hot off the press, just debuted very recently. And I'll just start by reading my blurb, and
Please.
then I'll elaborate a little bit more. But I said, spare in style, but elaborate in design. Oxford Soju Club is both a classic tale of spy versus spy and a deep meditation on Korean immigrant identity. Through an intricate cast of characters, this penetrating debut novel asks how each of us might shed our assigned aliases and throw ourselves into the waves of life. Jinwoo Park is a writer to watch. And I happened to have spent a summer in Oxford as a summer student, and so this was something of a nostalgic read for me to spend time in the streets of Oxford. And it's about the collision of a number of people, one North Korean, one Korean American in the CIA, another person from South Korea who's living in Oxford and trying to run a restaurant. The story is both, as I say, a meditation on Korean immigrant identity, but it's also a mystery. And in the classic style, it opens with a mysterious murder, and there's the interweaving of a number of storylines, all intricately and beautifully done. That's a book that I definitely recommend and hope your listeners out there will check out. And another title is Skin Hunger by Frances Boyle. Frances Boyle was a finalist for the Danuta Gleed Literary Award from the Writers Union of Canada for Best Debut Collection the year that We Two Alone was fortunate enough to receive the award. And Frances Boyle is a poet as well as a fiction writer. She's written a number of books. Jinwoo Park is based in Montreal, and Frances Boyle is based in Ottawa. And of Skin Hunger, I wrote, Skin Hunger is a moving mother-daughter story about all the ways we crave love and affection, alternating between the wayward lives of Evie and Rowan, The novel explores how absence, captivity, and privation affect humans and animals alike. Frances Boyle is a writer of sensitivity and perception, and Skin Hunger is her testament to hope and resilience. So this is an interesting mother-daughter story because unlike most, the mother and daughter are actually absent from each other for almost the entirety of the novel. They occupy two different eras, primarily Evie's stories taking place in Red Deer in the 60s at a time when mental illness is over-institutionalized and her motherhood is misunderstood. And Rowan, her daughter, is living in Vancouver in the 80s during the era of animal rights and animal liberation, which she's involved in. And so the story kind of works by juxtaposing these two lives. And yeah, it's another book that I hope your readers will put on their TBR lists.
That's one completely new to me, and that sounds fascinating. Now, I have to ask, as maybe my last question, as a reader or a writer, were you ever lucky enough to cross paths with Wayson Choy?
Yes, I was, in fact, lucky enough to cross paths with Wayson Choy. I went to the Humber School for Writers summer workshop one year. I also went to the Canadian Writers and Writing Programs Conference, which only ran a couple of times, but one time it was in Toronto. And so I met up with him a couple of times, and what I remember chiefly about Wayson Choi, and I think this is what many writers remember, is just his generosity. Here I am, doesn't know me from Job, I'm nobody, but he treated me with great generosity and respected me as a writer, just budding as I was. And recently, when I put together lists of books to recommend for 49th Shelf about the Second World War, Canadian works of fiction about the Second World War, I mentioned Wayson Choi's novels, and they're interesting because, for example, the Jade Peony does talk about Vancouver during the Second World War. And for example, one storyline is about a Chinese Canadian girl and a Japanese Canadian boy and their illicit romance, given the tensions between China and Japan. And it's interesting the way he dramatizes that period on the home front. And he is, of course, the maestro of writing about childhood in Chinatown. But interestingly, in All That Matters, we get to a point where a young white boy is about to go off to war, and then his young Chinese Canadian friend is watching him go off with some envy. And in some ways, his works end at that moment in adolescence where a boy at the time, although women did serve in non-combat roles, a boy or a girl at the time would have gone off to serve. His stories end at that stage of adolescence. So in some ways, The Riveter kind of picks up the torch about the lives of Chinese Canadians and goes on to talk about some Chinese Canadian characters at a slightly older stage of life who do in fact go on to serve. And so, at least in some ways, there's a kind of spiritual, perhaps, connection between
How
his work.
That's wonderful. I had the great privilege to have a very brief interaction where he was very generous to me in a signing line.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and it was like the day after I finished reading The Jade Peony, and I was still steeped in all the emotion of the way that novel ended,
right.
and the way he had beautiful handwriting, and he wrote a
Yeah,
long,
yeah,
and I don't know why I still haven't read any of his other books. I think I have all of them,
yeah,
but Jade Peony just still really lives in me.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
Wonderful. I can't wait to read your books, Jack Wang, and I hope you'll come back
Thank,
and we can
thank
talk
you.
about them.
I would love that. I would love that. Thanks so much for having me.
I haven't acquired a copy of The Riveter quite yet, but I look forward to reading it, and he was just a really interesting guest. I posted one video today. This is Thursday that I'm recording this, and today's the launch date for Allan Radcliffe's second novel, Blurred Faces, which I talked about in last week's Friday Reads, and I put up our lengthy chat about it earlier today, or before bed last night, my time, which would have been, I think, in the morning, UK time. And happy book launch day to him, and it was a great conversation. So that's the only video I've gotten up on my channel since last week. I have finished two books, and I'm going to do a bit of a check-in on a couple others. So let's start with the ones I finished. About 10 minutes ago, I finished The Catholic by David Plante, a gay novel from the 80s. This was for Shorty September. It was published 85, and I started reading it in about 1991 or something, and I got halfway through, and not because I wasn't enjoying it, I just put it aside, and I've kept it all these years. And one of the prompts of Shorty September was to read a book you've had on your shelf the longest, so that would be a short book, and so this was the obvious candidate. And I have to say that I remember loving the writing when I was in my 30s. Now that I'm considerably older, I didn't love it. I liked some of it. The book didn't bore me, but it was not a Sean book. It's about a Catholic gay man in the 70s or 80s trying to come to terms with being gay. And I relate to that struggle. I wasn't approaching it as a particularly religious person, and certainly not a Catholic. And so there's a lot of stuff that's really abstract and philosophical about being a Catholic that is written about quite abstractly in here that left me cold. There is a, I would say, almost gruesomely detailed sex scene that was fascinating to read, but I don't know that any of you watching, even the gay viewers, would enjoy reading that scene. I don't think I enjoyed it either, but I was just fascinated by the minutiae of the detail that he wrote about having sex, two men having sex, that I don't remember ever consciously thinking about those little tiny details. And so it was fascinating on that level. And so our protagonist, who's a guilt-ridden Catholic, thinks he's in love with this man. And it just causes a psychic breakdown almost in him, and he just starts acting weird in all areas of his life, and it kind of lost me there. And like I say, it held my interest, but by the end I wasn't sure if I liked it or not. So I would say it's somewhere between a 3 and a 4-star read. Nobody really talks about David Plante anymore. He's still alive. He's in his 80s, and I am not going to rush out and read another one, and I certainly didn't like it the way I was impressed by the writing as a, how old would I have been? My late 20s, in a way that I wasn't now that I'm in my late 30s, no, pushing 60. No, it didn't really work for me. But yet, it wasn't a complete waste of time. Probably going to be thinking about it for a while. And I wonder if anybody out there has read this or any other books by David Plante. Much more successfully, one of the best novels I read in quite some time is this 1947 British novel, and I'm late to the Patrick Hamilton party, but better late than never. And this is Patrick Hamilton's 1947 novel, The Slaves of Solitude, and I thought it was just a tremendous, wonderful novel. It's weird, too, in that we are mostly inside the consciousness, third person, mostly limited, but there's a couple other characters that you dip into their head, but mostly it's Miss Roach. She's about 40, she's never been married, and it's the Blitz. It's 1943. And because her apartment in London was bombed, she comes out into a suburb or whatever. It's got a fictional name. And lives in a boarding house. And in that boarding house is an old man, 70 maybe, Mr. Thwaites, who is a bully. And he mostly picks on her. And at first, as a reader, I thought, why doesn't she just tell him to go F himself? She doesn't, and she's always braced for going into the dining room at meal times because he's always picking at her. And then a German British woman moves in. She was a friend of our protagonist, Miss Roach's. Her name is Vicky, and the last thing I'll say about the plot is she had befriended Vicky because Vicky was the target of anti-German kind of harassment or abuse in the community, and Miss Roach had come to her aid, and that's how they became friendly. And she helped Vicky come and move into this boarding house, and then suddenly all hell breaks loose. The psychodynamics of the various people, but it's those three in particular. There's also an American lieutenant wandering around, stumbling around drunk, and it just gets ugly. It's adult bullying, and it was triggering. I was terribly bullied as a kid. I've occasionally been bullied as an adult because I'm such a wuss, but it was really hard to read in places, but it ended on a bit of an upbeat note. I thought it was masterfully done. It made me remember Elizabeth Taylor's last novel, Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont, that was set in an old folks' home, and there was a similar vibe, not quite to this extreme. This was extreme, but I thought it was as fine of a World War II novel as any I've read, and it was completely about civilian life. Even the American lieutenant, we never saw him in battle. It was all just happening in this little suburb of London, mostly in the boarding house and the pub next door, and all kinds of drinking. And you could see that it was some kind of a funhouse mirror image of all the stuff that was causing the war that they were isolated from. And that part ended up being quite profound as well. I will certainly read more novels by Patrick Hamilton, although I did read, I think it was in the introduction, or somewhere I read that this is his novel where the heroine is a woman, and in other of his novels, the women are typical male bullshit, male writer writing about women, not necessarily as enlightened as this one was. Don't know if that's true, just read a comment about that somewhere. This was a buddy read with one of my patrons and big supporter of this channel, Melanie, and so we recorded that chat. It'll be coming to you probably sometime next year. But, oh boy, what an incredible novel. The Slaves of Solitude by Patrick Hamilton. And just a couple of vibey things. I don't know if I'm comfortable with this word vibe, but just I'm not really checking in on books until I finish them anymore, because it just started to feel not what I wanted to be spending my time and yours doing. After 20 pages of a book, just check in when I'm done, but unless something strikes me. So in terms of things striking me, I will just say very quickly that Mary Jean is back on the saddle, so I'm reading to her every night again after about a 6 or 7 week break. And so we're back to reading Emma M. Lyon, Volume 6, and I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying reading it aloud after such a break. It wasn't the last thing I read to Mary Jean before we took a break, so it's probably been about 3 months since I read Volume 5, and some of the voices that I do voices for most of the characters, the main characters, and I can't remember all of them, so I'm having to reinvent them. But I'm having a good time with it, and it's so great to be back in daily contact with Mary Jean on Facebook Messenger. And I am 70 pages into this Elizabeth Jane Howard novel, published in 82, getting it right, and I'm loving it. But what I wanted to say is the main character is I don't know, he might be 35, I'm not sure how old he is, a British man working in a hair salon. And is he gay? Well, he's not sure. I'm going to be very curious to see how we end up. But he has gay friends that want to make him gay, or want to hook him up with a guy so that he can decide if he's gay or not. But he's a little bit prim about all those matters. Not sure what he thinks about women, not sure what he thinks about men. And he is a fascinating protagonist. And the main thing that I wanted to say is he's a hairstylist. And so there's extended scenes of him at work. And I enjoy extended scenes of protagonists at work. But this is just incredible. He's got all these regular customers, clients that come in, and some of them come in every day, and he really resents having to fuss over them because they don't need to be. They're just being stupid to coming in every day to get something done. But you get the backstory of their lives and how he feels about them and what he's actually doing, which is actually pretty interesting, and how he feels about the junior people that are helping him when he's doing a coloring or doing a perm. There's people like assistants, and they drive him crazy, and they're not very reliable, and the boss is an asshole, and this and that. And it is just so well done. Like every encounter, and certainly every customer, it's a potted narrative that could be its own novel. Just adoring it so far. Makes me want to go to the hair salon. What do you think? I think this is the first time this year, maybe ever, this year for sure, I'm pretty sure, that I'm not going to be starting anything new. And I don't actually have a plan to start anything new, other than once I finish my audiobook, I'll start a new audiobook. But beyond that, I think for the rest, there is one reread I might like to do. But I don't know that I'm not going to hold myself to this. But at this point, I think, Sean, don't start anything new for the rest of the year and just finish what you have, or finish a bunch of them. And start 2026 with a relatively clean slate. What do you think? What should I do? Should I do that? So that's my Friday Reads. Thanks so much for watching.